Welcome to the Wilhelm channel. My name is Wilhelm Murg, and I'm broadcasting from Tulsa. That's where everything happens around here. 100 years ago this month, we had the worst race riot in U.S. history in Tulsa. Uh, a young man named Dick Rowland got into an elevator with a woman named Sarah Page. She screamed. Somebody called the police. Long story short, the next day, Rowland turned himself into the police. A white mob had gathered together to lynch him, execute him, and a group of black veterans showed up armed to protect Rowland. The local police, head of the police department, explained that he had it under control. As the veterans went to leave, one of the mob grabbed one of the veterans' gun. It went off, and we ended up with 2 or 3 days of nonstop rioting. Uh, 10,000 people ended up without homes. Whole city blocks of black neighborhoods were burnt to the ground. Uh, Somewhere between 36 to 300 people were killed. As I speak right now in Tulsa, they're looking into a mass grave, a possible mass grave at one of our cemeteries located downtown. I say all that in preference because we don't really cover that in this interview. There are so many places to have better resources, and you can get a much fuller picture than two non African Americans in Tulsa who heard about it through innuendo for many years. But there are black people from Tulsa who never heard about it until they've gone somewhere else and went to college and heard about Black Wall Street, and heard about the Tulsa Massacre. And my family was 45 miles north of here in Pahuska. They knew something happened because there were families that found refuge in Pahuska, getting away from the violence down here in Tulsa. So Kris Rose wrote this fanzine, or not fanzine, but a zine, and the idea was to make something where she would take different books and write a small brief history for people that aren't into reading, massive histories, and kind of alternative history. I think in some ways, I think she came to some conclusions not everyone else has necessarily agreed upon. Uh, Kris, I met 20 years ago when I was publishing, when everyone was still publishing in Tulsa. She was living the kind of crusty punk life on the street lifestyle, but showed brilliance as a writer and as an artist. I kind of drug her kicking and screaming into the art world. Uh, a friend of mine said when I talk about it, it sounds like the film Nikita. It wasn't that bad. It was more like The Exorcist. But we got her there. Since then, she's become a published writer. She's owned her own bookstore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she took a lot of inspiration from Leroy Chapman. Leroy was a friend of mine who died a few years back. Uh, Maverick historian, maverick journalist who loved everything that was Tulsa, that was warts. Not warts and all. The warts are what he liked. He liked things like uh, Larry Clark photographing the junkie scene. He liked things like the Tulsa riots. He the underbelly, and basically through his work, the Tulsa Brady District, named for a Klansman that participated in the Tulsa riots, is now called the Tulsa Art Districts. The Brady Theater followed suit and changed it back to its original name, the Tulsa Theater, back from the old Art Deco days of Tulsa. And Leroy was just involved in a lot of great things. I'm really sorry that he's not around to bask in the glory of these victories that he had. Anyway, here's the interview.
I didn't hear about it until I was older, maybe 19 or 20, and I believe Leroy Chapman is the first
The
person
late Leroy
who told me
Chapman.
about it. And when he told me about it, I became so curious and slash outraged that he gave me a whole box of materials, including Death in a Promised Land by Scott Ellsworth. And I was partying a lot back then. I had a million roommates. I wish I had just poured through every bit of it, but I didn't. I kind of browsed through a lot of it. But then a few years later, I actually did manage to read Death in a Promised Land, cover to cover, and it was hard to read. It's a painful thing to
What
know.
year was this they gave you the box? Or...
Probably the late 90s. I would say
Okay.
97, 98. And the Ellsworth book was published in the 80s.
Right.
And before that, Mary Parrish had the book on the massacre that she had written in 1921 about her experience living through the massacre. And so when Ellsworth wrote his book, that was the first book since the 1920s that had been written about it. And he didn't get a lot of, attention at the time until the 2001 Race Riot Commission. And then everybody was reading his book then because it was in the newspapers, and, his was still the only, besides the Mary Parrish book, which was out of print and hard to find. So he was very encouraging on this project, when I told him what I wanted to do, which was basically read about 6 to 8 existing books on the massacre and kind of make a short compilation of just the highlights from each book, and to kind of have a shorthand that would be less intimidating to people who are not necessarily big readers. Randy Crable's book was very helpful to me. Scott Ellsworth. I got some really cool information out of Russell Cobb's book, The Great Oklahoma Swindle. And then, let's see, Hannibal Johnson's children's book I used as a reference, and a lot of Eddie Faye Gates' personal interviews with survivors of the massacre. I put a couple of first-person accounts in there. There's not very much material that I could find out there that was primary source material.
Yeah.
I found the court docket from the Dick Rowland case, which proved that Sarah Page was over the age of 18 at the time. In fact, she was probably, Randy Hopkins wrote an article about, he found Sarah Page, and she was in her early 20s at the time of the incident.
At the end, that they the love interest between Roland and
Page,
yeah, I've never heard that before, but I've never actually read a book. I mean, I've seen documentaries on PBS and that kind of thing.
That came from an interview. Ruth Sigler Avery. She was a white Oklahoman who was a child at the time of the race massacre, and she did a lot of personal interviews with survivors, and she interviewed Damie Rowland, who was Dick Rowland's adoptive mother. Sarah Page, she was in the process of getting a divorce, and she had moved to Tulsa with her husband for a job, and then he had to move back to, I think, Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, for work, and she wanted to stay in Tulsa. And so she was here waiting on a divorce, and where she lived was the Stroll. It was like the place where prostitutes would, stroll up and down and get their business. And, the interesting thing is that, Dick Rowland hung out down there with her a lot. And maybe they were just friends, and maybe he, looked out for her. Maybe she just lived in that area and wasn't even a working girl. Or maybe she was, and he kind of, looked after her and made sure she didn't get murdered or beat up or what have you. The story of her hitting him with her purse until the handles broke off, you don't do that to a man who you're not close with, like no man is gonna just let you beat the crap out of him with your bag if you aren't intimately close with each other in some way. They lied about her age. If they had been honest that she was a woman in her 20s that lived in the bad part of town who was in the middle of getting a divorce, then it wouldn't have been as sympathetic. People wouldn't have been as outraged. Um, she was a grown woman. She wasn't a child.
Yeah.
They portrayed her as an orphan who was 17 years old, virginal. And on the court docket, they even say that she was interfered with her virtue and her, all of this language about purity and virtue. She was a married woman. She wasn't a virgin, by any means.
Or a minor.
Yeah, she was a grown adult woman. And especially back then, a woman in her early 20s, that was, most women were long married and had kids by then.
So with Leroy, how long had he been obsessing with this before you met him? Because it sounds like he had quite a pile going.
He did.
By that point in the late 90s.
Yeah, it was like a mission to him to spread the word, to kind of proselytize and get the word out there and let people know about it. And he really took a kind of a break from all of that for a few years and did other things. And then later, a few years before he died, he kind of...
I think it was somewhere around 2007 or...
He got involved with this land. Really and then he started really ramping up all of the interests and the kind of obsessions that he had with finding, these secret histories.
Hanging out the historical society.
Exactly. He would find these rare books and documents and sell them to colleges and research libraries and things like that. And so it became a real thing for him. And he was also involved in the Bob Wills bus being brought back to Tulsa to be, refurbished and all of that. So he was anything having to do with Oklahoma history.
Well, the CNN did that 2-hour special on the riot, on the end of the 100-year anniversary. And I was happy that at one point there's Leroy Chapman on his bicycle riding through history, a clip from this land.
And
he did
the bicycle tours. And,
I was happy to see they actually put him in that.
Yeah, that was his purpose. That was his work. That was like what he was put on earth to do.
How's the distribution then? Where would people find this?
How
does it work?
It is available online through microcosmpublishing.com, and also they sell in a lot of independent bookstores, like Powell's Books in Portland carries it. It was on the top 10 for a few weeks in Oklahoma. I think number 7 was the highest that I got, over the centenary. But for a zine in Oklahoma, that's pretty cool. I don't know that there's ever been a zine in the top 10 best-selling books in Oklahoma before. Magic City Books carries it. Witty Books carries it. We could have been known for having this beautiful, progressive city, that's a shining example to the world. And instead, it's, a national shame. But we have another opportunity to be the shining example for the rest of the country as far as how we handle it now.